Acclaimed Shallow Wells founder, Jim McLean, takes us on a wide-ranging journey to everything Wells. From cultural influences, their place in our history, religion, and art, to how they helped shape our world and the contours of humanity. We will travel back in time to the origins of civilization, through myths and legends, across paintings and songs. Witness the fantastic journey unfold as we seek to understand our relationship with Earth's most precious resources. This is the World of Wells.
Wells are found in our earliest histories. We find that men have been telling the story of water wells as long as they have been digging water wells. I think one of the best examples of this is the Bible. It's no wonder that wells would have such a prominent place in our most important books. Man cannot live without water. You could probably live weeks without food, but without water, that changes to days. So water is life, and we see many examples of how important water really is in the Bible.
And he looked around, and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan toward Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt.
And from the very beginning in the book of Genesis, wells enter the story as Abraham travels from site to site, establishing wells, and as a result, the dominion of the territory around the well. Listen to these verses from the 21st chapter of Genesis.
Now I want you to promise in the name of God that you will always be loyal to me and my descendants, just as I have always been loyal to you in this land where you have lived as a foreigner. And so Abraham promised. One day Abraham told Abimelech,
"Some of your servants have taken over one of my wells."
"This is the first I've heard about it," Abimelech replied. "Why haven't you said something before? I don't have any idea who did it." Abraham gave Abimelech some sheep and cattle, and the two men made a peace treaty.
So here we see that Abimelech is from the land they are standing in, and Abraham has recently moved there, and they have agreed to be good neighbors. And then Abraham says, "Hey, you guys have invaded my territory. Taking over someone's well is very serious and could even lead to armed conflict. So a peace treaty is needed to settle the matter." But why is Abraham giving up this livestock? Listen as Abraham continues.
"Accept these 7 lambs from my hand as a witness that I dug this well."
So that place is called Beersheba, because the two men swore an oath there.
So it seems Abraham just wants to confirm his ownership. But he doesn't say, "Accept these 7 lambs" to say that I own this land. He says, "Accept these 7 lambs as proof that I dug the well," which means this is absolutely my territory. Only those who have my permission may drink from my well. People in those times would mark their well, writing their name on it to let strangers know who they were going to deal with for any water rights. One of the things I find very interesting is how the wells in the Bible each get their own name also. Some of their names are very beautiful and some not so much, but they all have a name of importance, a name that commemorates something very special, and sometimes even imbues the well with spiritual importance. Listen to how this particular well gets what I would consider to be a very beautiful name.
Hagar thought,
"Have I really seen God and lived to tell about it?"
so from then on she called him the God who sees me. That's why people call the well between Kadesh and Bered the well of the living one who sees me.
Now, all the wells we are talking about so far would be dug by hand. That's a very labor-intensive effort, as some of these wells could be as much as 50 feet deep. Here we are in a scene that probably hasn't changed much since Abraham was here 4,000 years ago. Arid desert, rainfall in inches per year. Water was so desperately needed by what was basically a nomadic culture. Sheep needed water, people needed water. Water was the most important thing in everybody's life. Existing was a day-to-day adventure. We're talking 700 years before Latin was formed, 3,000 years before Columbus, 4,000 years before electricity. What these people had to experience and deal with, people today cannot understand. It's why developing a water well, a secure source of water, was so important to the entire culture. It's why cities developed around water wells, why it was the center of activity and discussion in every community at that time. How would they go about finding water in those times? It was important to find the right location, have the right techniques, and have the right instincts, because a well may take, if not years, decades, some even generations to develop. It was so important that they had an idea of where they might put the well. Technique back then, they might actually get on their hands and knees and look across the desert. When they knew there was a humid area above the ground, they knew there might be water close to the soil surface. So they looked for distortions across the earth and see if there was an area that they could detect the humid air coming off the ground. They would also, of course, look for plants that like water. Cottonwoods, willows, oak trees. All these plants love water. If they had plants like that in an area, they knew there's a good chance there's probably water close to the surface. They would look for an area with a valley. The water would run off the mountains, come down the hillside, fill up the valleys with water, create shallow aquifers. It was important to find the water as easily and quickly as possible back at that time because it was so labor intensive. So even though these people were efficient at finding water, they didn't understand the science behind it. And what they saw, they just experienced and used that in finding water in another well. But what they were actually discovering was what we know today as hydrogeology. The hydrogeology is based on 3 zones in the earth on groundwater. You have your vadose zone, which is the dry zone. So if you dig a hole in your ground and it's dry, that's the vadose zone. But when you start to dig deeper, you'll discover the capillary fringe. What the capillary fringe is very similar if you were to put a piece of paper into a bowl of water. The water would travel up that piece of paper in the small spaces and tubes in that paper. Well, the same thing happens under earth. Once they found that capillary fringe, they knew they were getting close to water. They knew to continue digging because they knew what was below that was the actual water table or the phradic zone. And the phradic zone is the area where all the spaces in the soil, in the sand, is filled with water. That's the saturated zone, the phradic zone. And that's what they were looking for. Anytime they hit that, they were at the top of the water table. They would keep digging into that until there was enough water coming back through the phradic zone pore spaces to fill the well as they were digging it. And that would establish their water supply for generations. So how would the well actually be constructed? It would be dug. You use shovels, picks, stone hammers, leather buckets, but labor intensive. There was so much labor involved in these episodes that digging a well 30, 40, 50 feet deep, you'd put somebody down in the well as it was being dug. When you went through the shallow sands with the unconsolidated materials at the top, they'd have to put stones around the well to keep it from falling in on itself. The unconsolidated materials had to be kept together, just like digging a hole at the beach today. If you try to dig a hole at the beach, the sand would just keep coming in and coming in. They would use the stones to hold the hole open. Once they get down deep enough, into what's considered a consolidated formation like limestone. They would use their stone hews and chop into the limestone. Once they got down into the water would start filling into the hole. They would use the buckets to dip the water out. If the water was coming in so rapidly that they couldn't keep up with the bucket, they knew they were deep enough. If not, they would keep digging until the hole was deep enough that as the water filled into the hole and they couldn't keep up with it with the bucket, they knew they were deep enough. With that type of technique, even during a drought, if they had to go deeper, they would go even deeper. So you'd have somebody at the bottom of this well with a bucket. You would have a wheel, pulley at the top. You'd pull the water bucket out. They dump the material out, put it back in the ground, and they repeat this over and over again. Very labor intensive, would take years to do this sometimes. Once the well was completed, they would try to protect the groundwater by building a protection around the well. It might be made out of stones, it might be made out of a mud brick, but the idea was to keep groundwater from flowing into the well because they were just as worried about keeping their groundwater clean as we are today. There's a lot of animals around the site. Groundwater running across the ground into the well would really ruin the well. So they built these protection zones around the well. They would also put a capstone on top of the well, usually made out of a large piece of stone that would protect anything else from falling into the well. Interestingly, when they go back and look at these old wells, it's like a time capsule. And they'll look at the silt in the bottom of these wells and they'll pick up artifacts out of these wells from that era that people, even back then, felt the need to throw something down the well. But using that technique, wells can be dug 40, 50, 60 feet, even 300 and 800 feet deep in some places. So it was so important to develop that well, keep it clean, keep it protected, and the whole community evolved around that well. So it's no wonder that folks were very serious about protecting their efforts from possible abuse by neighbors or even sabotage by enemies. We see an example of this kind of sabotage as our story continues. Abraham has died, and his son and heir Isaac is now in contention with Abimelech.
And Isaac was so successful that he became very rich. In fact, the Philistines were jealous of the large number of sheep, goats, and slaves that Isaac owned. And they stopped up the wells that Abraham's servants had dug before his death. Finally, Abimelech said,
Isaac, I want you to leave our country. You have become too powerful to stay here.
Here we talk more about livestock because livestock are wealth, even to this day. And livestock require a great deal of water. So if you want to drive a bunch of shepherds off their land, you fill their well up and stop their water flow.
Isaac left and settled in Gerar Valley, where he cleaned out those wells that the Philistines had stopped up. Isaac gave each of the wells the same name that Abraham had given to them. While his servants were digging in the valley, they found a spring-fed well. The shepherds of Gerar Valley quarreled with Isaac's shepherds and claimed the water belonged to them. So the well was named Quarrel, because they had quarreled with Isaac.
Here Isaac makes sure that all of their wells retain the name that his father had given them. These wells prove this was once Abraham's territory, and he is the heir to that territory. And now that we have come across a spring-fed well, as you can see on the graphic, a spring-fed well is a natural occurring water source. And notice they also named the spring-fed well with another one of those fascinating names. Sometimes they were lucky enough to actually discover a natural spring. A natural spring is created by what's considered a confining bed. And a confining bed doesn't allow water to pass through it or above it. And once the water is trapped under that confining bed, it will travel underneath that confining bed until it finds a break, or maybe the confining bed ceased to exist. Wherever that water is able to come out of that confining bed, that's considered an artesian flow. And that artesian water would flow out of the spring, and they would be lucky enough to find one of those springs. Sometimes they would artificially enhance that spring, so they get even more water than they could get naturally. If they weren't lucky enough to find a natural spring, they might drill a mother well near the foothill of a mountain and allow gravity to flow through these underground canal systems called qanats. And a qanat would be dug much like a well, except it's a horizontal canal underground. And as they were digging through the alluvial plain at a slope, it would allow water to flow from under the water table at the mother well back through the alluvial plain, back to the development, perhaps where all the commerce and all the water usage was really needed. So they'd actually develop a man-made spring made up of these qanat systems and a mother well.
Isaac's servants dug another well, and the shepherds also quarreled about it. So that well was named Jealous. Finally, they dug one more well. There was no quarreling this time, and the well was named Lots of Room, because the Lord had given them room and would make them very successful.
Earlier we learned that Isaac was the heir of Abraham. Wells are a huge part of that inheritance. All of his livestock depend on the water, and it also makes him master of this territory. Wells are often synonymous with prosperity, plentiful source, supply. And we see that here in the promise of the well called Lots of Room. It will literally make them very successful. As we wrapped up this chapter in the story of wells, we skip ahead many hundreds of years to the New Testament and the story of the woman at the well.
Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her,
Will you give me a drink?
His disciples had gone to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him,
You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?
For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her,
If you knew the gift of God, and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water.
In this story, Jesus meets a woman at the local well and uses a drink of water to illustrate a spiritual truth. Wells were common gathering places, as everyone needs the water from the well to live. This kind of gathering is still seen today, as people gather around the water cooler or meet in local coffee shops or even the pub. The watering hole is a place to talk about major happenings or even plan for the future. We've gone back in history to look at the very beginnings of the world of wells. Around these wells, complete dominion was established. And if you had a well, you had a much better chance of maintaining your dominion over that area. Around these wells, you might discuss peace. You very well might discuss war. It was also a place where families would be planned because it was a meeting place. People would come to get water. It's where people met their wives. It's where they rejoiced. It's where they celebrated birthdays, celebrated events, because it was so important to have this water source, and that's what the cities and the culture were centered on. Before I go, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we do at McLean's Shallow Wells. We have been drilling wells in the Savannah area for over 40 years. Our shallow wells are eco-friendly and used primarily as a source of irrigation for your home or business. McLean's Shallow Well can save you a bunch of money on your water bill and can be installed quickly and efficiently. If you'd like to learn more about shallow wells, please visit our website at www.shallowwells.com. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on the World of Wells.